This is our 7th class, and we're going to be talking about the fall of Samaria today. Last time we talked about the destruction of the house of Ahab by Jehu. Jehu had been anointed by Elisha, and he had been commissioned to travel into Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and destroy the house of Ahab, which he did. He killed a son of Ahab, Joram, and then he proceeded to kill Jezebel, the entire family of Ahab, have the crown princes up in Samaria decapitated, and he basically expunged the land of Baal worship. But sadly, he did not return to the practice of the Lord, which he was supposed to do. And there are a couple of details that I neglected last time. There was a prophecy by Elijah to Ahab. After Ahab and Jezebel had appropriated the vineyard of Naboth by false witness and having him stoned so that they could take the property, Elijah confronted him, and he said to Ahab, "In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood." I didn't show the fulfillment of that prophecy last week, so I wanted to take a moment and do that. Ahab, and actually the king of Jerusalem at the time, Jehoshaphat, the two of them in concert had been fighting the Arameans across the river. Ahab had tried to disguise himself by what he was wearing, but it says someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel, that's Ahab, between the sections of his armor. So the king died, he was brought to Samaria, and they buried him there. Now, he was fighting at Ramoth Gilead, which was a city over on the Jordan side of the Great Rift. They would have had to take his body and his chariot down into the rift, which would be about 15 or 20 miles, and then another 15 or 20 miles up to Samaria. So that would have been about 2 days of travel. And once they got him back there and buried him, they would have wanted to clean his chariot. It was a royal chariot. It would have been much more elegant than the standard war chariots. And it says they washed the chariot at a pool in Samaria where the prostitutes bathed, an unclean, undesirable place. And it says dogs licked up his blood as the word of the Lord had declared. So that particular prophecy had been fulfilled. And then we talked about the second part of his prophecy where Elijah said to Ahab, not only are the dogs going to lick up your blood, but dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. And that's what happened. Jehu came galloping up. Jezebel had done her hair up and her put on her makeup and a new dress, and she was waiting for him. He said, throw her down, and she was tossed out of the window, fell among the hooves of the horses, the war horses that were down below, and they trampled her to death. To complete the prophecy, Jehu, after he had her thrown out of the window, he took a break, he went in, ate and drank, and when they went back out to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. Presumably feral dogs running in the streets had literally torn her body apart. So both prophecies had been fulfilled. And then Jehu embarked on his complete eradication of the family, all of the relatives, all of the friends, all of the associates, anybody associated with the line of Ahab, and then he took the throne himself. The next question that we need to look at is who became the kings? Jehu had killed the king of Israel and the king of Judah at the same moment. The young Ahaziah, he was 22 years old, had just taken the throne down in Jerusalem, and Ahaziah would have been a half-nephew of Joram, so they're relatives. And when Jehu came galloping in where they were visiting each other, he killed Joram and he killed Ahaziah. And the question is, who becomes king in the two kingdoms now? Well, in the case of Israel, it's very simple. Jehu has completely destroyed anybody from the family of Ahab who might have a claim on the throne. And of course, he was controlling the military, and he was in Samaria, and he was in control, so he took the throne. And Jehu would rule, and his line would rule for the next 5 generations. His Jehu himself, his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, and a great-great-grandson. In other words, he was the longest-lived of any of the Israelite dynasties. On the other hand, down in Jerusalem, theoretically, a son of Ahaziah should take the throne. But Ahaziah was only 22 years old. He had several sons already. These men had multiple wives and multiple concubines, and we are told that there were several princes, but they're all little babies. They're 1, 2, 3 years old probably. And theoretically, one of those sons should become the king. He would be appointed as king even as a baby, and then they would have a regent or some kind of an advisor who would supervise his upbringing until he was old enough to take the throne. That often didn't work very well because the supervisors often wanted the throne, and these young princes often died of accidents along the way, and the regents would then be able to take the throne. But theoretically, that's what should have happened. However, the grandmother of these young princes, whose name was Athaliah, we've talked about her, at this point she probably was about 40 years old. She would have been married at 15 or 16. She has a 22-year-old son. And so we have a woman who's relatively young, and she decided she was going to take the throne, and she, we are told, destroyed the family of would have been her husband Jehoram as well as Ahaziah, anybody from that particular line, and then she appropriated the throne herself. Now, she was the queen mother. She'd been there for 20-some years as the queen and now the queen mother. She probably had her political alliances, her military connections, people that supported her, and so she was able to take the throne. But a few years later, she herself was assassinated, and one of the sons of Ahaziah, who had survived the slaughter, who was now 8 years old, took the throne. And the Bible tells us about all this. Let's take a look at what they say. It says, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. Now, those would be her grandchildren, and those would have been the other children of her husband while she was queen. There would have been additional wives and concubines, so anybody in that line could take the throne. Ordinarily, it would be a son, but if there wasn't a son, then it might be a half-brother, it might be an uncle, it might be a brother of the king, anybody in that particular line. So she proceeded to apparently wipe out anybody who might have a claim on the throne. It says, though, that the sister of Ahaziah, the young king, and this would have been a half-sister, almost certainly. This would not have been a daughter of Athaliah. It would have been a daughter from one of these other wives, but she was a half-sister of Ahaziah, and apparently she found out what was going to happen. It says she stole Joash, the son of Ahaziah, from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered, so he was not killed. So she found one of these little babies. She probably was a half-aunt. She's probably taking care of these little kids, and she knows one of these, and she hid him away in the temple for the next several years. He remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years while Athaliah ruled the land. And it turns out she was indeed a vile woman, every bit the daughter of Ahab. She introduced Baalism, which we're going to see in a moment, and must have been a hated queen, but she was on the throne. She had her support. And in the 7th year, it says they brought Joash out, brought the little fella out. They put him in the courtyard in front of the temple along with a military guard, all of the military leaders who apparently were supporters of this coup. They put the crown on him, proclaimed him king, and the people shouted, "Long live the king." Athaliah was in the palace right next to the temple. These two were close to each other in a large courtyard. And it says she came out, she heard the noise made by the guards and the people, and she went to the people at the temple of Yahweh. She looked out, saw what was happening. She screamed, "Treason, treason." They grabbed her and dragged her off and executed her. And they dragged her away from the temple so that she would not contaminate the temple with her blood. It says they seized her and she was put to death. And as a matter of fact, we had somebody who recorded that with a drawing that we've been able to dig up, and there's Athaliah about to be executed by the palace guard. Now, the husband of the half-sister, his name was Jehoiada, He was a priest. He wasn't the high priest, but he had been helping to hide the young boy away and apparently was involved in his upbringing, and he was perhaps a secret worshiper, if not an open worshiper of Yahweh. And it says, at that point, he made a covenant between Yahweh and the king and the people that they would be the Lord's people. In other words, he would return the faith of the land back to the worship of Yahweh. Now, unfortunately, it wouldn't last very long, but we have these cycles where people would repent and return to the faith of Yahweh and then slip back into paganism again. It says, all of the people of the land went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. So there was a temple of Baal someplace near Jerusalem, if not up on the Temple Mount, which of itself would be a terrible desecration. And then it says they smashed the altars and idols to pieces. They killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altar. And for a while, the young king promoted the faith of Yahweh, but it says he allowed all of these pagan altars and high places to remain. So we still have a mixed religion in the land. This is in Judah, right around the city of Jerusalem, where Solomon himself had committed the terrible apostasy that started it all off. Meanwhile, back in Samaria, we're going to focus on Samaria now. Things down in Judah just continued to decline bit by bit, and we'll talk about that next time. But we're going to look at the last 100 and some years of the kingdom of Israel. We've talked about the first half. We've looked at the time from Jeroboam down to the assassination of Joram by Jehu. And what we're going to focus on today is the very precipitous decline into destruction that happened after Jehu took the throne. Jehu did his assassinations about 850, but the city of Samaria wasn't destroyed for another 125 years. So things continued to decline. They became increasingly paganistic, increasingly vile, until eventually the entire city was destroyed. You can see that Jehu had a son, Jehoahaz, and then Jehoash and Jeroboam II and Zechariah. He went 5 generations down to the great-great-grandson, but none of the other kings lasted for more than a generation or two because of constant assassinations and political chaos. The time of Ahab was a time of the rise of the Arameans, who were the next kingdom over. And there was constant skirmishing going between them back and forth. Jehu's descendants had serious problems with the Arameans, but then the truly terrible kingdom of the ancient world had risen to power by that time. These are the Assyrians. And so as you read down through the various kings, you find that they're fighting Arameans, and then all of a sudden they're fighting Assyrians. Well, that's because the Assyrians over in what is modern Iraq today had finally spread all the way to the Mediterranean and were conquering everything in their way. They were a terrible, terrible kingdom. They had a standing army, one of the first kingdoms to ever have that, a standing professional army. They had specialists. They had slingers and bowmen. They had infantry. They had cavalry. They had siege machinery. For example, battering rams. They had sappers who could dig under the walls. And when they set up a siege of your city, it was almost a certainty that the city would fall. If you put up any kind of resistance, the men would all be tortured to death. And if you didn't, the men would be enslaved, the women would be used in various ways as servants and as concubines, and the children may or may not survive. So it was a terrible thing when the Assyrians came to town. Zechariah was assassinated shortly after he took the throne. He was assassinated by a fellow named Shallum. Jehu and his family ruled for about 100 years. And then things, around the time of the Assyrians, things really took a turn for the worst up in Israel. Zechariah was assassinated by Shallum, who a couple of months later was assassinated by Menahem. Menahem was a truly vile, despicable king. He ruled for a while, but his son Pekahiah was assassinated by Pekah, who was assassinated by Hoshea, and Hoshea was king on the throne when the Assyrians came and burned the city and took them all into exile. So you can see things took a terrible turn after Jehu, and that's what we're going to look at. I said Menahem was a terrible person. I thought I'd show you an example of the kind of kingship that was taking place. It says Menahem sacked Tifsa and ripped open all the pregnant women. Why would you do that? Well, again, as an example, and also to eliminate threats to the throne, but you can see the terrible behavior of these various kings and the depths of degradation that the various pagan cultures had brought them to. Now, we first see Assyria at this point. It says Pul, king of Assyria. I don't know why he's referred to as Pul, because in a couple of verses later he's referred to as Tiglath-Pileser, and that's who we know from history. A very powerful Assyrian king invaded the land, and this is during the time of Menahem. This is just a couple of decades before the destruction of Samaria. Pul invaded the land with his Assyrian army. He was coming towards Samaria, and apparently Menahem bribed him. It says he gave him 1,000 talents of silver, which is an enormous weight of silver. Talents are discs of melted metal. A talent of gold, a talent of silver. 1,000 of these was a huge sum, and it says the king of Assyria withdrew and stayed in the land no longer. So during the reign of Menahem, things settled down a little bit. They continued to pay their tribute. Basically, that's protection money. You give money to the Assyrians and they leave you alone, which is to their advantage as well. Because if they destroy your country, it's going to be generations before it's a productive land again. So he allowed things to quiet down, but then Menahem died. His son, Menahem's son, was assassinated, and Pekah took the throne. And it says in the time of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser came back. This is probably 15, 20 years later. Tributes no longer being paid, and the Syrian army comes back, and it says they took Iyon, Abel-Bet-Makkah, Yanoah, Kedesh, and Hatzor, and then it goes on to point out that they took Gilead and Galilee. In other words, the Assyrians came in and took all of the smaller cities of the northern kingdom of Israel. The only thing that was left was Samaria. Things have gotten really bad at this point. We have records from Tiglath-Pileser of these Assyrian campaigns. There were 3 in a row. This is near the end of his life. In the summer of 730, incidentally, the summers were considered the campaign season. You couldn't really field an army, march an army through the land in the winter. There's no food for them to forage. It's cold, it's wet, it's muddy. So they campaigned in the summer while the men are still at home. They've planted their crops, and now the armies can assemble. They need something to do in the summer. The Assyrians changed all that with their professional armies. They would wander through, and then they would take up a siege position around a city and stay there for 2 or 3 years if necessary. So anyway, Tiglath-Pileser campaigned down the coast, conquered all of the smaller towns along the way, and then a couple of the major cities, including Gezer, which was a big fortification that guarded the way up into the hill country. The next summer, he campaigned down the middle of the area, and he conquered Hatzor and Megiddo, again, 2 of the major cities on the trade routes, so now he's controlling all the access into and out of Israel. And then his third campaign, he actually conquered the city of Damascus, as well as many other small cities. And incidentally, cities were any urban center that had a wall and a gate. City to us means a big site as opposed to a town or a village, but a city in those days was a fortified habitation. If it was a town or a village, these were these unfortified villages around the outside. So when they talk about all the cities they conquered, it may be a tiny little place with a small wall and a little gate, and the Assyrians would have run over it in a couple of days. Or it could be a major city like Samaria or Jerusalem, heavily fortified and almost impregnable. So with his third campaign, he conquered the city of Damascus, and that left 2 major cities in the central portion of the Holy Land, one being Samaria and the other being 50 miles down the road, the city of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was somewhat insulated from everything that was going on because the Assyrians were up to the north and campaigning. But the city, as we're going to see next time, would have suffered huge numbers of immigrants fleeing from the north. The Assyrians are up there rampaging, and thousands of people came down to live around Jerusalem, creating tremendous problems for the king there His name was Hezekiah, and we'll talk about that next time. Tiglath-Pileser died, and his throne was taken by a fellow named Shalmaneser V, and he invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. Things had deteriorated, tribute wasn't being paid, the Assyrian king was frustrated, and he brought his entire army against Samaria, and this would have been a single campaign by Shalmaneser. In 722, he marched down the center of the land and laid siege to Samaria. He died during the siege, a year or two after it started, and another king named Sargon, who's mentioned in the Bible, took the throne and completed the siege. Now, a siege in those days was absolutely terrible, and the Bible gives us a couple of clues about that. The way you would conquer an enormous city with heavy walls, big gates, towers, plenty of food inside, was to surround the city with an army, allow nobody in or out, and starve them out. Now, a city the size of Jerusalem or Samaria might take 2 or 3 years, 4 years. In the meantime, they would be attacking. They'd try to attack the gates, they'd attack the towers, they'd have their sappers trying to dig under the walls. And what they would do is dig tunnels under the walls supported by wood beams, and then once they had the tunnel completed, they would set the beams on fire. The sappers would try to run out, many times not making it, and the walls would collapse down into this tunnel, and then a big breach in the wall would be made. But in the meantime, they're trying to starve you out. And as you begin to starve, the level of civility in the city completely disappears. You have people hoarding. You have disease coming because people are weakened. You have dead bodies lying in the street and being thrown out of the wall over the wall if they can. The water becomes polluted. And when the city finally falls, most of the people in the city are dead. And the ones that have survived are so weakened that frequently they're of no value whatsoever to the conquerors, but it was a terrible, terrible thing to go through. And we are given a couple of clues about that. The city of Samaria had been besieged earlier by the Arameans. This is back probably during the time of Joash, because Elisha was the prophet at the time. So this would have been 100-some years earlier. They were under siege, and the king, whoever he was, and he's not mentioned, wandered around the city defenses to see what was going on and to get a sense of the mood of the city, and a woman complained to him. She said to me, this woman said to me, "Give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son." In other words, the city has been reduced to cannibalism. And this woman goes on to say in her complaint, "So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him,' but she had hidden him." In other words, the complaint is not that we are under siege and you're not protecting us. Her complaint is she ate her child last night, and then this woman cheated her by hiding her son away. And this shows the depths of the despair and the behavior of these people during these terrible, terrible sieges. So anyway, we have a 3-year siege that went on before the city of Samaria collapsed. It says the king of Assyria, now this would have been Sargon by this time because Sennacherib had died. It said he captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria, and they are still there. Now, "they are still there" is written by somebody back then, and at the time he was penning those words, he was saying they've never come back. But this was a practice that the Assyrians did. They would take conquered peoples and transplant them into various regions of Assyria that they had just conquered so as to remove any leadership that might foment rebellion. Now they've depopulated the area, so they would take somebody from another conquered area and bring them over and place them there so that they could raise crops and pay the taxes and so forth. The king of Assyria brought people from Assyria and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites that they had previously moved. We have outside confirmation of this particular Bible passage as well as historically. This is a prism. These are clay, they're not tablets, they're cylinders about this size that have flat surfaces that you can write on. It's called a prism. This one was commissioned by Sargon after he conquered Samaria. It was found in Nimrud, an Assyrian city. That's why it's called the Nimrud prism. And on it, he talks about the conquest that he did. He said, the Sumerians, the people of Samaria, who conspired with a hostile king to not render servitude and to not render tribute, opened hostilities. Now notice what he's saying here. He's saying it wasn't my fault. They didn't pay me tribute. They started it, so I brought my army in. And then in another section it says, in the strength of the great gods I engaged them. 27,000 people with chariots, deities, their helpers. I counted as spoil. He carried all of this off as spoil. Thousands of people, chariots, all of the various worshipers, all of the little idols, their deities, their helpers, the priests. And he carried them all off into Assyria someplace. And then he goes on to say, 200 chariots for my royal contingent I conscripted from among them. Chariot was an expensive item. You had to have a team of horses, plus a second team of horses, plus trainers, men to take care of the horses. You had to have your soldiers and your drivers, and it was expensive to make them anyway. So 200 chariots, he appropriates those and puts those in his army. The rest of them I settled within the land of Assyria. And then he goes on and says, the city of Samaria I resettled and made it greater than before, bigger. In other words, he brought a lot of people in. People of the lands conquered by my own hands I installed there. So I brought people from there and put them here. And then the Bible says the very same thing. The king of Assyria brought people from conquered lands and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. We have very good confirmation of what happened and the people who did it. These newly settled people had problems. Apparently bad luck. In the first few years, they couldn't grow crops. They were being attacked by lions. Now, the land had been devastated for years, and there was nobody growing anything. It had reverted to a wilderness to some degree, and wild animals would proliferate, and so they were having problems. And in those days, problems were typically attributed to the displeasure of the god of the land who lived there. The god lived there. And so these newly arrived immigrants were assuming that they weren't worshiping their gods properly. Whoever was there, they didn't know how to do it. So it says, the king of Assyria gave this order, have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the god of the land requires. So you have one of these pagan priests coming back and instructing all of these pagans in how to worship in that land according to the practices that had been there before the Assyrians came. One of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship Yahweh. Now, I find this to be a little bit curious because the worship of Yahweh was not being practiced in that area, hadn't been for a couple of hundred years. There must have been some secret priests, some people who were still adhering to the old rule, the old religion, and so they brought back some kind of a distorted version of the Yahwist faith. But then what would happen is you would blend that with the pagan beliefs of these fellows coming in. You still have some worshipers of the sin of Jeroboam. And so this all became blended together in a really bizarre syncretism, a mix of all different religions. And that's exactly what it says here. Nevertheless, each group made its own gods in the towns where they settled, and they set up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. In other words, all these high places are still out there, and they brought their own gods and set them up there. They were still worshiping, in some fashion, the faith of Yahweh. And so you have this bizarre religion that was no unique faith. It says they worshiped Yahweh, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. To this day, they persist in their former practices. They neither worship Yahweh nor adhere to the laws and commands that Yahweh gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel. Now, what's the significance of all this? Well, these are the Samaritans. When you read in the New Testament about the despised and hated Samaritans, these are the people that 700 years earlier kind of put together their own version of the faith. Now, when the city of Jerusalem was conquered and the people of Judah were taken into exile, they were the practitioners of the faith of Yahweh. They went to Babylon, and while they were there, they got organized and they recreated their faith into what is fairly close to modern Judaism today. And they came back to Jerusalem, and these folks up in Samaria said, we'd like to work with you. And they said, no, you don't have the proper faith. And the hatred and the enmity that began at that point was still in place 700 years later when Jesus was preaching and talking about the Samaritans. And that's because of this bizarre syncretism that they were dealing with. There are still Samaritans there at Mount Gerizim, a very small community of about 10,000. It's been genetically severely compromised because they can only marry within their populace. And so they have a lot of problems up there, a lot of genetic problems. But there is indeed a culture of Samaritans up at Mount Gerizim.
But they're not good Samaritans.
But they're not good Samaritans, no. Okay, it says, and then we have in 2 Kings 17 a very long explanation of why this all happened, and I've summarized a little bit of it here. It says this took place because the Israelites, the people in Israel, had sinned against Yahweh their God. And how did they do that? They worshipped other gods, they built high places, they set up sacred stones and Asherah poles, these little wooden totems that had, we think, that had a carving of the goddess Asherah on it. They did wicked things. They worshipped idols. Yahweh warned Israel and Judah, but they wouldn't listen. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They worshipped Baal. They sacrificed sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sorcery and sold themselves to do evil, went into prostitution, basically, both male and female. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. So that's why all of this took place. It took time to build up, and unfortunately, it points out that only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Now, there would be periods of revival. One of those happened with Hezekiah. One of those happened with Josiah much later, and we'll talk about those over the next two sessions. The people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. Who are they? They're the 10 lost tribes of Israel. You hear about them. There are lots of curious theories about where these tribes ended up, and they have people who suggest that Eskimos or the South Pacific, that they're all over the world. Actually, what probably happened is they were already pagans. They went into a pagan land, they would have been assimilated into that culture and simply disappeared, stopped being Israelites and became whatever the local people were. So the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Now, the upshot of all of this is that prior to the arrival of the Assyrians, you had multiple cultures around the land. You had Israel and Judah, of course. We've been talking about that. You had an Aramean community, which was increasingly warlike and constantly causing problems primarily with Israel. You have Ammonites and Moabites and Edomites and Egyptians. But by the time Tiglath-Pileser had conquered the northern area and the city of Samaria fell and they transplanted all of the various Assyrian transplants, the end result was that the Assyrians controlled the entire area all the way down to Egypt. And those few years after the Assyrians had taken Samaria, you have a tiny little island of Judah, which is basically the city of Jerusalem and its environs. And the Assyrians controlled everything else. And even though they call it the kingdom of Judah, and they talk about the various kings of Judah, this is a tiny little community set up in the hills. The Assyrians attacked it once and failed and just didn't bother again because there was nothing there. It was a big it was a fortified city, and it was important, but there was nothing of value there to make it worth wasting an army besieging the city again. And so they were able to survive for another 125 years before the Babylonians finally conquered the city. So that's where we stand. The kingdom of Israel has been destroyed. The kingdom of Judah has been reduced to a tiny, tiny little island in the middle of an Assyrian world. And we'll pick up the story next time with Hezekiah, his tunnel. I'll show you some pictures of the tunnel. That's always fun, the city of Jerusalem. And so next time, Hezekiah and his tunnel. And there's a very, very important man who was serving as prophet to Hezekiah at that time. His name's Isaiah. So we'll talk a little bit about the prophecies of Isaiah. And very important, so you don't want to miss it.